Welcome. This is the Punk CX podcast. My name is Adrian Swinscoe, and I'm an advisor, best-selling author, Forbes contributor, and general explorer of the service and experience space. On the podcast, I seek out and interview entrepreneurs, leading business people, authors, tech leaders, academics, and generally cool people doing interesting stuff in the service and experience space. Check out the archive at adrianswinscoe.com. That's enough from me. Let's get into the interview. Before we get into the interview, I want to give a big shout out and thank you to all of the folks at CGS for sponsoring my podcast this month. Now, CGS is a company you might not have heard of, but they have been delivering brand building and customer experiences for 40 years for global brands that you will definitely have heard of. Over that time, they have developed deep expertise in both outsourcing and technology, so you should definitely pay attention to what they have to say. On that note, they've recently put together a free ebook and video that I'd like to point you to. It's called The Transformative Power of Generative AI and ChatGPT, and has been authored by CGS's Executive Vice President and Chief Technology Officer, John Samuel. It's a really comprehensive guide and is designed to deliver insights, summarize research, and also inspire creative problem solving. So do check out the link to the ebook and video in the show notes. Now, let's get into the interview. So welcome to the next edition of the Punk CX podcast. With me today, I have Walter Fla, who is the Chief Data Officer of Dentsu in Canada. Hey, Walter, how you doing?
Hi, Adrian. Good to talk to you.
Now, Walter, tell me a bit about yourself. Bit of a thumbnail sketch. Tell us kind of like what you do and kind of like and what you're about, and tell us like some of the stuff that you get involved with.
All right, it's going to be a big thumbnail because I'm about 2 meters tall, but I am originally from Holland. I joined Dentsu just about 15 years ago. Back then, in terms of basically CRM development, things like that. Went through GDPR, became a GDPR refugee in the good sense of the word, moved to Canada, and currently I hold this dual role of Chief Data Officer for Dentsu, and I lead our CX practice called Merkle. Mm-hmm. So Dentsu is like one of these big six advertising and communications agencies, really focusing globally on, okay, what are the messages that we put in front of people? How do we put them there? And how do we develop better CX? So that's roughly the scope of what we do.
Awesome. Now, the third, and we've talked before about lots of different kind of like things. And some of the things we touched on before was around this empathy and inclusivity and how we engage with people. And I've long been an advocate for empathy and inclusivity in the experiences in the experiences that we design and deliver. So I wanted to talk to you, have you on the podcast. I know that you've recently published this white paper called Attracting Attention and the Power of Compassion, Attention Economy, a Dentsu Study for Canada. And I was a bit like, long title. Okay, fine. I'll ask
Very
you.
true. Fair point.
I'll ask you to tell me a little bit more about the white paper, its main theses, and its also headline findings, and then we can have a bit of a rummage around.
Yeah, for sure. So across the things that we do, attention is incredibly important. You can imagine if you're putting ads in front of people or you're putting experiences in front of people, those cost money, and it makes no sense if people aren't looking at them, right? So at the most basic utilitarian business aspect, it makes sense to understand attention. And we know that this is a critical factor, especially knowing that around the world, we estimate about $727 billion USD is actually put in front of people in terms of media spends to reach them. And 3 out of 5 of those are digital. And digital means that there's some algorithm involved usually.
Right.
So the intersection between algorithms and attention really, really is important to understand.
Okay.
Just the scope of the study.
And what were the big findings?
So we really went into this study trying to understand this attention more. Also because like in 2015, there's this famous study that Times Magazine did about this goldfish and how we now have less attention span than a goldfish as humans, which would be like 8 seconds.
Which, quite frankly, is preposterous.
Exactly.
If you think about it, you go, that means that why is it that movies tend to get longer and yet we're kind of more sort of enthralled by movies? And they made like movies generally are like, it feels quite odd sometimes when you get a movie that's like an hour and a half and most of them are about 2 hours, if not longer. And then people get into marathon gaming sessions and things, and they'll go for hours and hours and hours. And you look at it and go, you couldn't do that if you were a goldfish.
Exactly. It's when you open your Netflix now, there's a special category that actually says series that you can binge in a weekend. Right? That's a big drain of attention. So we knew that there was something there that we wanted to unpack. And really what it got down to was, okay, we know that people have substantial attention capability, or as we call it, attentional control, which is concentration. But what triggers it, and how can we make sure that it's triggered in a positive way and not in a negative way?
Right.
Because you can get attention in both ways.
Yeah, I mean, then you get into, you start to err into the kind of dark patterns type of side in the behavioral psychology that comes from popularized by Nerial and his work on Hooked, I think it was. And then but it was based on the work out of Stanford of, what's his name? BJ Fogg.
Yeah. All the micro habits. I think so. For me, there's two parts to that, right? So on the one hand, you can really take a negative way to approach the understanding of things that call for attention in terms of nudging. And on the other hand, with this algorithmic look or with this AI look, it turns out that if you ask a machine that in itself has no ethics, if you ask a machine to gain someone's attention, they're just going to make you mad. Right. And we see that happening every day on many different platforms. And those platforms have as their core goal to increase people's attention, because that's what they get paid for, because advertisers want to put messages in front of them while their eyeballs on screen. So it's an incredible thing to need to unpack.
Can you help me understand, though, a bit more about that sort of ethical side of kind of things? Because that's, and that kind of fine balance, because sometimes, I mean, I remember seeing studies that talked about, it sort of leaned into this. I think it was one of the things we talked about before. We talked about kind of personalization. And I remember seeing a study once where the majority of people were saying, yes, we want a more personalized experience. The majority of brands were agreeing that that's what they wanted to deliver. But when they asked marketeers about how many of them would openly admit to have done things or campaigns that would border on creepy, or they wouldn't felt sort of okay if they'd with them, if they'd sent done them, if they've consumed them as consumers, as it were, and 60% of them admitted to have been part of something they would have said, it definitely fall in the domain of creepy or somewhat creepy. And so there's this kind of fine balance when you get into those commercial kind of interests and things around ethics. Sometimes gets chucked over the shoulder and go like, no, it's about hitting our quarterly numbers. So can I help me understand that sort of the ethical side of things? And also, how do we balance that off in terms of the commercial interests of brands?
So I think if I really oversimplify CX, it really boils down to scaling the personal touch, right?
Okay.
We have a historical expectation of the personal touch. Technology allows us to scale that, and consumer behaviors are also changing in the sense that their expectations of brands go up, right? If you ask any brand, hey, are you doing a good job in your customer experience? On average, we know that about 80% of the brands will say, yeah, we're doing a fairly good job. And about 20% of consumers will agree. There's a gap there, right? I think the scaling up of that personal touch only is useful and actually effective when you bring in some form of compassion, and we'll probably talk about compassion a fair bit, but you need to actually add value and you need to resonate with people, because otherwise it just goes completely out of control. Like, imagine the situation, and I know this is a standard kind of like CX or CRM conversation, but imagine you're going to this coffee shop and they know exactly what you want, right? The normal kind of baseline for CRM conversations. That makes total sense. Yes, I want people to remember that I've been in that store once before, and I also want them to remember what I like. What I don't want them to do is call the entire neighborhood that I was in their store again.
Sure.
Right? Like, imagine you're going to that store and it's like, Adrian's here again. He just ordered this and this and this. And then it's another store down the street going like, yeah, I just saw him reading a newspaper. And then another store goes like, yeah, I heard he's interested in a new car also.
Sure.
That's where you're starting to cross some boundaries, and frankly, also why a lot of the technological changes are happening in tracking, I think, and digital ID. So for me, the economic benefit and the ethical benefit actually intersect, because ultimately, and this is maybe a little bit utopian, but I believe ultimately that the best use of data is for companies and consumers to better understand and help each other.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, absolutely. I think that's kind of spot on. But so in that, because I read the white paper and there's quite a lot of different levels in that in terms of the analysis and stuff. And I was a bit like kind of pulling faces as I was reading it. But I actually thought it was like, there's some really interesting stuff in there. And what I want you to do is maybe could you unpack what you found in terms of what drives attention? Because actually we talk about attention, but I think in a broader CX sort of sense, we're actually talking about engagement.
Yes.
Because that's really what we're driving for. Attention is this thing. You get good and bad attention, but it's almost engagement is the thing that we want, which is this like an ongoing sort of relationship.
Yeah, really, it's that next level, right? It starts with attention, and then you have a shot at getting some engagement. I think the thing that we see consistently is that there's a mind shift that needs to change, where attention is not something that you can claim. If you claim attention, you've got your 8 seconds, right?
Okay.
Attention is something that is given. And it sounds very soft, but you can almost see it as a form of generosity from the person that you're trying to get them or their attention from. And to get to that level of generosity, obviously you need to resonate with them. You need to be useful. You need to, in a fair way, look at the value that you're adding to their life compared to what you're getting from them in terms of things like data.
Yeah.
And really have best intention in mind, right? That's, I think, how your compassion leads to consumer generosity.
Yeah. So thank you for that, Walter. Now, I know the study was focused on Canada only right now, but do you think there are lessons that can be taken from this and applied kind of more broadly? I mean, is it that, do you think that some of the findings are kind of universal and we can apply it, or is there going to be nuances, but there's broader lessons that we can that we can learn?
Yeah, I think broadly it is actually transferable. We actually do this study globally, so we know some of the global results, and I think the Canadian context is different. The data landscape is different here. We're also a country that's very focused on immigration as a target, which is not true for all markets. And there's a lot of lifestyle difference between things like urban and rural, because it's a very, very big place, right? In terms of things like diversity and those kind of things, it is a different market. But ultimately, we're talking about human insights. And one of the things that we're calling out in the study is that you really want to talk with people, asking them questions that they can emotionally resonate with, which has been around for like 2,300 years. So turns out humans don't change all that much. And I would take that as an account. And ultimately, you're just trying to understand people, which is the very, very core of marketing, right? Right.
And I think so what should brands be doing in order to deliver this more thoughtful and empathetic and inclusive sort of experience, to build this sort of in order to generate attention, but also build engagement? Because also going to mean, it seems to me that the way that you were talking just then, and you're chief data officer, of course. There's like a data landscape element that has to be relevant to the people you're trying to engage. And there's a first party data bit, but it also feels like it needs to go further than that. You need to go into that zero party kind of data bit in order to get to that next level of insight. Is that the kind of like the missing kind of piece, do you think?
For sure. Yeah, I think zero party data and also qualitative research are underestimated to a degree, because it's very nice to know what people are doing, but you very often want to know why, so that you can do more with that. And with zero party data and getting that answer from them directly, really, really helps getting there. I think in terms of what brands can do, there's a personal and there's a broader context to it. On the personal side, I think you need to resonate with people as they are, showing that compassion, making sure that you hit the right emotions and that you provide the right value, as well as the products and services that actually need to serve a purpose and add value, right? One thing that we did learn, though, in the study on a broader scope is that the amount of attention that people have available gets influenced by how they feel about themselves and the world that they live in and how they are treated. Okay. So when we think about things like inclusivity and diversity, representation always comes up and it's super important. Mm-hmm. But it's also important to realize that literally if people feel less part of society, if they don't feel accepted, if they feel more threats to their psychology, their attentional space goes way down because they're getting into kind of like this survival mode, right? And it makes a lot of sense to think that you're going to be open to a lot less messages when you're in that attention squeeze.
Sure.
So I would also really keep looking at things like inclusion and diversity, not as hey, we're only doing this good for society, which absolutely it is, but also just as a business thing.
Yeah, and that makes complete sense when you say it like that. It's like if you don't make people feel that they matter, and everything that you do, then why would you matter to them?
I love that. And think about all the experiences that you go through with companies and how often can you say, yeah, I feel like I matter.
Yeah. And so you can't take that mattering, as it were, for granted.
Yeah.
You have to make sure that people matter and then show them that they matter. Yeah. And then because there's a lot of people that are, and it's not just about different marginalized, disenfranchised communities, but it's also about economic pressure as well that many people are feeling kind of right now. And so there's a lot of pressures on a lot of people. And so actually kind of leaning into this, and which makes the work for brands actually a lot harder. And that's one of the things I was going to ask you about was this feels like it's got implications for people that are in that experience and digital, and particularly digital experience sort of space, the professionals and leaders and stuff. And it's like, you can't just sit back and just hope that the data lakes and the LEDs on the servers are going to take care of all this. I mean, surely there's going to be implications for people themselves, the leaders, the professionals in these teams that are trying to deliver these experiences. I mean, can you talk to that? What do you think? What's it going to take for the human element to move the technological and data element on?
Yeah, I think especially on the CX side of things, we have a lot of really great practitioners that can design amazing experiences that look fantastic, that work fantastic. But you always need to realize that there's a caveat there, which is it looks fantastic and it works fantastic for all the people that looks like the person that designed it or that have a similar background to the person that designed it. Right. Sure. And we know that to a degree from accessibility, but it's way beyond that. Right. It is in Canada, if you're new to the country and you're trying to buy a car, you don't have a credit score yet. So you won't be able to get financing. So how do you deal with that? That's an automotive journey. There's lots of services that you actually need good internet or easy mobility. There are fly-in communities. There's even on the most basic things, in just the basics, gender stereotyping, right? When you look at the messaging that goes out, if you look at some ads, like shaving ads, for instance, right? It's still often the case that in our imaging, we just think that only men shave their faces and only women shave their bodies.
Yeah.
Right.
Or at the time of recording, we've got the Tour de France has just kind of started. Yeah. And never have kind of a group of kind of like men being kind of more shaved all over than we have kind of the people that are tearing about France.
Exactly. And there's 100 of those examples, right? Like why are detergent ads only broadcasted during the day targeted to women? Why, if we're talking about cooking, it is women content, but if we're talking about barbecue, suddenly it's male. Like it makes no sense. It really makes no sense. And that's just the basic messaging, not even talking about the design of experiences. And we need to align all of those to essentially how the world really works. And do that through real understanding of societies rather than dragnetting individual people's data.
Yeah. I hear on all of that. But I also going to know that that's all great.
Mm-hmm.
But sometimes it's about translating from forgive me for describing this with the platitudinal to the actual kind of the practical sort of thing.
Yeah.
And do you have a couple of examples of clients that you say that actually kind of like they get it,
mm-hmm.
and they're doing kind of some really interesting kind of things? Because I love those kind of like stories, because it's about that translating of the kind of the insight. And most of these companies, generally speaking, I find, are already doing this stuff even before kind of all this research that supports what they're doing has already come out, because they just feel it in their bones and they decide that that's what they're going to do. But if you've got a couple of examples that you can share with us, tell me about kind of what they're doing, why they're doing it, what they've achieved, and what sort of outcomes they've generated, that'd be great.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think there's pockets of excellence across many different companies. For me, there's not one gold standard, simply because our data and tech landscape is too messy for anyone to actually get to the perfect experience, right? There's a lot. This is a very nascent industry, even though it's been around for a very, very long time, and it's incredibly messy. But I love the different angles that some companies take. Like, for instance, a Spotify.
Mm-hmm.
So Spotify, to me, and I know they do lots of cool things with data, but to me, it's an interesting company because of the way that they actually structured their company, and that the way that they work and develop actually inspired many other companies to also start working in a much more kind of like agile, scrummy way.
Mm-hmm.
And they've made a real impact in terms of how many, many thousands of people work. For me, that's a cool part. I know it's not in the immediate kind of like different messaging, but for me, that's a really cool part. Or for a company like, let's say like Muji. I don't know if you know them, the Japanese. The way that they build brand love through simplicity, to me, is like amazing. And like if you see how soon consumers start loving them, and Uniqlo to a degree has the same kind of like vibe going on, right? It doesn't matter if you're in high fashion or low fashion, if you're in fast or slow moving, if you're fashionista or not, the amount of brand love that you can get through the basics there, I think they're a perfect blend between filling the needs that people have and having them resonate with you.
Yeah.
And I think the last one I think I'd really love to call out, this is more of a Canadian one. There's a company called Loblaws. They are a prime grocery retailer here in Canada, and not without controversy sometimes. But what I really love is how they took all of their consumer insights and basically put it into their private labels.
Right.
And then off of the private labels, they have two brands. It's President's Choice and No Name. One's kind of like more in the upper, and the other one's more in the discount side of things. The way that they position them, and actually how that then drives their loyalty program, which then actually drives a media business, which was one of the earliest retail media players that actually wanted to give back to consumers also.
Right.
Through the loyalty program. I think that those are wonderful examples.
Nice. Well, I don't know much about the Canadian example. I mean, but Spotify's kind of legendary in its approach to tribes and
exactly,
and how they organize things. But the kind of Muji and Uniqlo they're almost like the perennial favorites sort of thing. They just kind of show up, and they what's fascinating about them, I mean, and it's not wanting to, there is this love of like form and function particularly in Japanese culture. Mm-hmm. And I see it when my father has grown bonsai for the longest time.
Right.
And there's sort of the practice of all of that. And I, I love, it feels like some of the stuff that they do very much translates into sort of that. There's so much care and attention taken to it. So it's almost like everything we do it's craft based.
Yeah.
There's this love of kind of what we do. And I think that it sort of translates into how they design their stores and what they choose. And more often than not, it feels like they're not chasing things. Mm-hmm. It's almost a bit like, this is what we do.
Yeah.
And then we kind of iterate on it, but actually 80% of it pretty much stays the same. And it's just like, what you stand for. And there's this reliability to that, not a thirst for doing new things, as it were, all of the time, because we have to reinvent ourselves.
I think that's super fair, and I might be overbearing it a little bit, but when you say like care, attention, craft, and they're not chasing something, those are terms that you would probably more normally use in personal relationships. Like, I have this great friend, and they right,
Sure.
they're caring and they pay attention, and they're not out for things with alternative motives or something like that.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's super true, and I might be a bit biased because Dentsu is a Japanese culture,
Right.
Japanese organization with like a century history.
Mm-hmm.
But that long-term view, that non-transactional approach to experiences, I think is gold, and makes me actually hesitant for a lot of the flashy CX. Like, I love what some of the pure players are doing and how seamless some experiences are, but the flashy CX to me is almost the easy one.
Mm-hmm.
It's the ones where you really create the relationships that are much more deep, right?
Yeah. I mean, so Walter, anything else that I wanted to ask you a couple of things, just to kind of wrap up sort of thing. But is there anything else that you want to highlight or add from the study that we've missed out that you wanted to sort of talk about?
I think for me, but this is also just because of where the world is right now, I think it'd be really interesting to double click on what the consequences of this attention are for the boom that we're seeing in AI.
Right.
It's a lot of, like, we've been focusing on AI for a couple of years already, but I think right now, rightfully, there's a lot of discussions on what big tech should do, what big tech shouldn't do, how good or bad the source data is. Should we pause? Should we not pause? Is this the apocalypse? Sure, it makes sense to discuss these things, but the way I'm starting to look at it more and more is these big tech players, they're building a power tool, almost like a chainsaw.
Yeah.
And they are absolutely responsible making sure that this chainsaw is reliable and safe. But put a chainsaw in people's hands and you're going to get very different outcomes, right? There's a lot of user responsibility, like marketers, advertisers, but also just individual people. What you do with that chainsaw is going to be super important. And I think there's not enough focus on that personal responsibility yet.
Sure.
And that's really an area that I'm excited to kind of unpacking a little bit more.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I had a previous guest on the show who made a sort of similar point, and they used a great analogy. It says that there's no point having a fast bike if you don't know how to ride it.
Yeah.
And it's just because you become a danger to yourself and others. Absolutely. In many ways. But I think that there is that, I think you're absolutely right about that sort of personal responsibility, and both professionally and also in consumer sort of terms, about being a bit more conscious about what you do and why you're doing it. But I think there's a possibility that we'll start to see things kind of like splinter off. You'll end up getting this kind of like maelstrom of mush.
Yeah,
it's all kind of AI generated, and I think then you'll get, and I think we've seen segments of that kind of already starting to appear. You know, like some of the slow movements that are spinning out, where people are just going, actually, I like the human endeavor of things. You know, things that are handcrafted, handmade, all of these different sort of things. Yes, we can use. Everything doesn't need to be technology first. It's about what's the value proposition, what's on offer, and ultimately we need to not forget that actually there's people at the end of everything.
Yeah, I think that's totally true. And like, one thing we know from AI is that it's inherently anti-creative, right? It's math looking for the most likely next things. The most likely next thing is not a masterpiece of something, right? It's a regurgitation of things that happened before, which is not bad. Like, a lot of the basic creativity comes from there. But we do know that just when you look at how these models work, as soon as they start learning from themselves, so they start generating stuff that goes out there that then becomes re-ingested, and they start kind of like iteratively learning on itself, you end up with, as you call it, mush. And it is very true. Like, you just get like some meaningless fluff. And I think that's really, really important to take an eye on. Another thing that I think, just to hammer down the point on bias and inclusivity, a lot of the performance of AI in terms of lack of inclusivity is being blamed on the data that goes in there. And that's very true, right? If like all your data is Silicon Valley, you're not going to have great representation of the whole world. But interestingly, we've done a lot of experiments with how individual people can actually resolve some of those issues.
Mm-hmm.
And the most interesting thing, I think, the outcome there was the more aware you are of your biases, the better you can actually interject those into the AI as prompts, and the
Mm-hmm.
better your output's going to be. So for instance, if you ask an AI, hey, give me an image of a happy family, it's going to give you male, female, white, mid-30s, 1 or 2 kids smiling at a camera, right?
Yeah.
If you ask an AI to do it 100 times, that's what you're going to get as a result. If you're aware of different compositions of family in society and you start prompting, hey, give me an image of a happy family, take into account that there are various age groups and sexual preferences, compositions, ethnicities, and all of these things, it'll do a better job.
Mm-hmm.
So this comes back to kind of like the personal responsibilities. The better we get at all of this stuff, the better our AIs also will get. Not because the math is so good, but because we can control them better.
Yeah. You know, that is a kind of fair point. I mean, it comes down to, I mean, it's somebody said to me that actually, or somewhere I read that actually the new skill on the block, as it were, is prompt engineering.
Yeah, I read about that too. Yeah.
And I was a bit like, yeah, okay. Sure.
For the next 12 to 24 months.
Yeah. And then somebody will invent kind of like an automation in order to do that sort of thing. So if we were to boil it all down and thinking about the findings out of the white paper and about trying to be more inclusive, more passionate, kind of show more compassion, more useful to, to more relevant, and to trying to resonate with kind of people more as we kind of try and engage people for the right reasons.
Mm-hmm.
What would be your best advice to somebody listening in that wants to improve their customer experience, thinking with all these kind of the challenges, this kind of the attention being the number one? What would be the things like Walter says, do this?
Walter says, think about CX in 3 layers. The simple and effective moments that do what they need to do. Mm-hmm. That roll up into experiences that actually give that meaning, call for the attention, resonate with people, that are a collection of those moments, and then provide those experiences in a way that ultimately ladder up into those meaningful relationships. I think too often we get bogged down into journeys. And there's nothing wrong with journeys in principle, but there's only 2 ways to make them. Either you have a smart designer designing how the world should work, or you have a smart analytics person designing or analyzing data about journeys and coming up with this ball of looping, interjecting, knotted up journeys that don't really work practically. So I would really try to build that layer cake of moments, experiences, relationships. And then I think if you hit all 3 well, you kind of pay off on the ambition.
Nice. So Walter, thank you for that. Couple of final questions before we go. Sure. These are the kind of the pop quiz ones.
All right, let's do it.
First one. Say I've been asking these questions for the last. I don't want to count how many years now, but they're the punk related ones. And so the first question is, what 1 or 2 words would you use to describe a more punk approach to customer experience? And I must a health warning on that I've been collecting a lot of them. We're now up to 188. So, drum roll.
It's going to be a warning. Don't be a spaghetti monster.
Was that the answer?
Yeah.
That's totally not on there. I'm writing that down. I have no idea what that means, but you have to explain kind of what that means.
All right. So spaghetti is, to me, what customer journeys look like when you analyze them.
Right.
And as I kind of like alluded to, we need to break this all up and go back to effective moments that actually create meaningful experiences that actually ladder up to deep relationships. So don't be a spaghetti monster.
I think I'm just going to truncate that down to kind of like no spaghetti monsters.
Fair enough.
Because it's like I'm trying to kind of get it really short. But no, I love
spaghetti.
It. Yeah, because it's also aligned. It's also aligned with that sort of thing around that thinking around jobs to be done type of things. Because people have this kind of fanciful thing about, people go through this, and when they do that, and they'll do that, and you're like going, have you met people? You're like, people that don't do that sort of stuff.
Yeah, and it's also actually, now that I think about it, like you talk to a lot of people about CX, obviously, and you'll recognize their eyes glaze over if they start realizing all the things that they need to do in their company to actually get ahead on CX. It's almost like they're staring at this like big ball of spaghetti, right? And it's like, okay, how do I pick this apart?
Oh, crumbs! Exactly, exactly. So the second question is, so this is related to Punk. The first one was related to Punk CX. The next one is related to Punk XL, which is introduced this notion that it's no longer sufficient to talk about customer experience in isolation. We have to think about it more holistically. As you alluded to, there's all these different concerns about different sort of like kind of people, our impact on the world, what it means for us and the relationships we have with our customers, but also the relationships we have with our stakeholders, suppliers, our employees, and contractors, et cetera, and we need to talk about experience leadership, so in a more holistic way. So what company or brand do you think is an experienced leader, and why?
We already talked to a few of them.
Mm-hmm.
I think those still stand. For me, maybe it's better to actually come up with a name of a punk band on this. I'm going off script here. I would say Waste and Harm Reduction, which I think would be a good band name, right? I don't know.
Okay.
Ultimately, a lot of the objectives that we're going for, obviously, there's a lot of softness to it. There's a lot of humanity to it. There's a lot of society to it. But it really boils down to two main parts, which is the waste, the attention waste, the human waste, the data waste, the investment waste, all of the different waste that needs to go out of the system. And then the harm reduction, which is things like, are we having media dollars feed disinformation and harm? Are we normalizing messages with our CX and advertising that give people views of how the world works, but it really doesn't? Go think back about a few of those examples, right? Like the shaving or things like that.
Sure.
So I think waste and harm reduction need to be a focus of organizations. And I think right now we need to get from military organizations and governments to get that level of thinking into normal organizations, into companies.
There you go. Here. So one final thing, because almost related to what you were talking about kind of there, lots of doom scrolling going on right now. The world is a bit of a crazy place. I mean, what had been crazy since kind of like 2020. And we seem to have come past that. And then we kind of emerged from that into 2022. And then it got crazier again. With conflict and inflation and supply chain shocks and ships running aground and all these different sort of things. And so I've been asking people to share with me a bit of a good news story. And so I've been saying to them, tell me the most interesting or positive or exciting thing that you've seen in the last week.
Awesome. So for me, it's a little bit political, but on the Canadian front, just because that's where I live. So I saw that this week. There was a big celebration on Canada hitting 40 million people after having almost 1.5 million people join last year.
Wow.
There was a CBC article, so let's say our BBC, on that. And it essentially looked at all the ways that Canada is attracting immigration and wants to attract immigration, which I think is a breath of fresh air compared to some other countries. Obviously, different countries are in different situations, but I thought that was a wonderfully, a wonderful breath of fresh air. Yeah.
Well, yeah, particularly when you've got many kind of like much of the rhetoric around the world is many people saying no, or putting up walls, or shutting windows, or locking doors and things. And it's nice to hear people say, actually, you're welcome.
Yeah, I totally agree.
Fair play. So what a nice story to finish on. Thank you very much. Walter,
you're welcome.
That's it for today. Thank you for sharing your time and your insight and your experience with us today. And congratulations on the white paper stuff. We'll make sure we can get all that linked up when we publish this, so we can put people in the direction of that if they want to learn kind of more. But yeah, thank you for that. That's been awesome.
Amazing. And thank you for having me.
Wow, what a great interview. I hope you enjoyed it. I know I did. Find out more about me and the work that I do at adrianswinscoe.com. Do leave a review on your favorite podcast platform. And if you have any comments, feedback, or questions about the podcast, then feel free to send me a message to podcast@adrianswinscoe.com. And do tune in again. Thanks very much.